All right, next little video here, just a kind of a brief run through of a few different types of homeostatic imbalances of the brain and spinal cord that are fairly common. So just briefly, some different types of traumatic brain injury. So unfortunately, these happen pretty frequently. You're going to see a lot of this if you're working in the medical field. Now, maybe some of us have experienced before a concussion. This is where you have a temporary alteration in function. So maybe some of your cerebral cortex neurons have been temporarily injured. They're not functioning properly, but their abilities and so forth will be repaired and healed. That's called a concussion. A contusion within the brain is where you have like a permanent loss of function, like maybe some neurons actually died, and neurons do not get replaced. So once they're dead, they're gone. So that can involve a contusion to the brain. It's a more serious type problem. Sometimes people experience subdural or subarachnoid hemorrhages. Okay, so that's where you've had some sort of an injury, like maybe you've taken a blow to the head, and of course you got blood vessels all up in this area, of course, and if they start leaking, and this is happening beneath the skull bone, if you have blood vessels that rupture beneath there around your meninges, you can wind up with a subdural or a subarachnoid hemorrhage. That's blood loss. You start getting a pool of blood building up in that area. As you guys know, you don't have a lot of space up there between the brain and the skull bones. So that pressure building up can actually force the brainstem through the foramen magnum. And that connects. If that gets shoved through there, neurons get stripped off of the brainstem. In Biology 202, you're going to hear a lot more about brainstem functions, but you have areas in the brain stem that control your respirations and your breathing as well as other bodily functions, and so that's going to result in death pretty quickly. If somebody has cerebral edema, this is where you have swelling of the brain tissue itself, so any type of traumatic head injury, like if you're in an accident, can lead to that. That's inflammation in the brain. Inflammation can get triggered in your brain just like it can in other areas. So brain tissues swell. That's not a good thing. You know, you can wind up experiencing what you see over here as well, where the brainstem might wind up getting shoved through the foramen magnum, or just having your cerebral cortex swelling and pressing up against your skull bones. That's, you know, not a good thing. Okay, strokes are a common type of brain injury or brain homeostatic imbalance, and they're also called CVAs, or cerebrovascular accident. So this is where you wind up with a blockage in an artery that is supplying blood to some part of the brain. And so if you cut off the blood supply to certain areas of the brain, of course, those neurons can wind up dying pretty quickly, and they don't get replaced, so you can wind up losing the functions of the affected areas. So this typically leads to hemiplegia, so you might wind up with lack of brain function on one side of the brain or the other, because if you have a stroke that affects the left side of the brain, it's going to be functions over on the right side that are that wind up being inhibited. Same thing over on the right-hand side of the brain. You have a stroke over here, it's going to affect functions over on the left side of the brain. And of course, some strokes, as we all know, are more severe than others. You know, you may lose senses, or, you know, maybe you just kind of slow down with some of your movements and so forth. They're not quite as fast as they used to be because you've lost some of the neurons that helped control those types of movements. Now, sometimes people experience what are called TIAs. That is a transient ischemic attack. Ischemia is where the oxygen supply has been cut off to a tissue. That tissue is suffering from an oxygen deficit. So that can be temporary and short enough so that the neurons don't actually die. So temporarily they lack oxygen gas. So guess what? They can't make the ATP that they need. They're not functioning as well as they could. If they can't generate their ATP, they're not going to be able to do their action potential signaling. So you can have some loss of some functions, but if that blood supply is restored, then you can regain some of those functions. Sometimes this happens with people who have migraines. If you ever know somebody who has severe migraines and they lose some of their brain function temporarily, maybe they can't speak for a while, but then it returns to normal later, and sometimes that's due to arteries being compressed during the migraine. There's vasoconstriction that's taking place, and it's cutting off a lot of the blood supply to certain areas of the brain. So it would be a kind of a type of TIA that's occurring. Sometimes TIAs precede an actual stroke that's going to happen in some people. There is an approved treatment for stroke. If somebody shows up in an emergency room having stroke symptoms, they may be given tissue plasminogen activator, or TPA. When you study blood clotting in Biology 202, you'll learn more about plasminogen and what its role is. But it's a natural substance that we have in the blood that helps break apart blood clots. And so this drug actually activates plasminogen to do its job and can help break down blood clots, because it's a blood clot in an artery that blocks the blood flow to an area of the brain. That's what's going on when you have a stroke. Spinal cord trauma, these are also unfortunately fairly common types of injuries that can occur. And if you wind up with severe damage to the ventral root of a particular spinal nerve, so remember the spinal nerve, you have a ventral root, you have a dorsal root. Dorsal root contains axons of sensory neurons coming into the spinal cord. The ventral root, or the anterior root, has axons of motor neurons sending signals outward. So if that gets cut or damaged, you're cutting off the communication to the skeletal muscles that are served by that area of the spinal cord. Or the ventral horn, that's where the cell bodies of the motor neurons are located. And so if you have damage, death of the motor neurons in that area, that's going to cut off the signaling to skeletal muscles. So that's can wind up eliminating or reducing both voluntary or involuntary control of muscles, depending on how severe the injury is. Also, your muscles will atrophy in those cases. Atrophy refers to when you don't use your muscles, the myofibrils inside there break down. You're not using the actin and the myosin proteins anymore, and so they wind up degrading and not being replaced, and so your muscle size winds up degrading. That's muscle atrophy. A spinal cord transection is very severe. This is where the whole spinal cord gets sliced all the way across. And so, of course, as soon as that happens, you're slicing through those ascending and descending tracks that we talked about on a earlier lecture. And so you're no longer sending or receiving signals from the brain to and from the brain. From that point lower, I almost said upward, from that point lower, you're cutting off motor and sensory controls. So a person will become a paraplegic. So they'll lose function of the lower limbs if that transection occurs between your T1 and your L1 spinal nerves. And you're a quadriplegic if the spinal cord gets severed in the cervical region of the neck. Because when that happens, then you have cut off the signaling even to the spinal nerves that control your arm movements. If this transection occurs lower between T1 and L1, you'll still have your arm function, because the spinal nerves that serve your the muscles of your arms are still receiving their signals from the brain, and also you can also send sensations upward from those areas. But if the spinal cord gets transected up in the neck, you're cutting off motor and sensory control for all four of your limbs and other body areas as well. All right, so that was just a kind of a brief. Of course, there are many, many, many other types of homeostatic imbalances. Some of those are discussed in your textbook if you would like to read about those further. The next video lecture, we're actually going to talk a little bit more about the ANS, or the autonomic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system will be discussed a lot in Biology 202, so we're not going to go into a lot of depth in this particular lecture. I'm just going to kind of give you an overview so you have a little bit more background before you get to Biology 202 next semester.